I don't know how many schools change football and basketball coaches in the same year. Obviously, wildly different circumstances and scenarios, but that's the spot we find ourselves in. Juwan Howard out after 5 seasons, and that move was made on Friday. Juwan breaking his silence on Sunday, putting out a statement filled with gratitude. It was all love and all. I can't say he's happy with the way things gone, but for a member of the Fab Five to come back and have a chance to coach the school, obviously on the way out the door, a lot of gratitude with that, given the stuff that he went through personally as well. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, we don't need to have the discussion on whether it needed to happen or not. I think 8-24 on its own, 3-17 in Big Ten play was. It seemed like it was trending this direction, and now Michigan has an open job. And Clayton, I want to start here because you wrote, after the move was made on Friday, you had written something about, I think before we start discussing what candidates look like and discussing who might come here, who might be interested, I think a big question you have to ask yourself is how good of a job is this? Because I don't think Michigan basketball's problems just go out the door with Juwan Howard. I mean, certainly there are things in NIL and admissions that need to get sorted out. Obviously, a lot of administrative things that can probably be done better to support whoever the next guy is. So I think there are, for as much as you want to lay the fleet at the blame of Juwan Howard, and make no mistake about it, I mean, I think he does have to wear the brunt of that. But I think there are also lessons from the University of Michigan end of things on maybe things they should emphasize in this next coaching search and selling a vision to prospective candidates.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when John Beilein left, it was in May. It was for an NBA job. You maybe didn't get the wide array of candidates that you would have liked given the timing. Now, they get rid of Juwan Howard last Friday, pretty up to par with the other schools around the country that are making coaching changes. It's right here in the middle of the coaching carousel. But the program's in a different spot after 5 years of Juwan Howard. And yeah, Juwan had some success early on in his career. Obviously, the last 2 years didn't go the way they wanted them to, including this past season. Part of that is because he wasn't a good enough coach. As we know, that's why he's no longer here. There were cracks in the culture, and they just didn't do a good job sustaining what they had when they were the first 3 years, continuing what John Beilein had built. But part of that also is because of what Michigan's operation is from a basketball standpoint and the way college basketball has changed. And maybe Michigan has not evolved quite to the way it's needed to continue to win on the court. And a couple things that keep coming up in different reports, one from Jeff Goodman, the other one from an ESPN.com article, are that it's, there are some potential candidates out there who are saying, at least, off the record to a couple different reporters, that there are challenges that come with this Michigan job. Everybody saw, and this played out pretty publicly the last 2 years, they weren't able to get Terrence Shannon in due to admissions. They weren't able to get Caleb Love in due to admissions as well. Different problems with admissions in those two different cases, but nonetheless, those played out pretty publicly. That was kind of the narrative that was out there. And then the second thing, so the academic standards and everything is one thing, and then NIL is another thing, and probably played a part in at least one of those other ones, and Michigan whiffing on some other transfer targets as well. So part of what schools are selling now when they're trying to hire a coach is the salary, all the regular contract stuff that you have to work out anyway, but also what kind of plan they have in place. I think I brought this up last week before Michigan even had a change, but we talked about it on this show where On3's Pete Nakos reported that Louisville has $3 to $4 million pretty much in the bank in their collective right now to build a roster for next season. And that's going to be for the next coach to use that, basically their own mini salary cap. Well, does Michigan have a plan like that? Because those are the discussions that are going to have to be had beyond the preliminary ones that you have in the beginning of a search. And if you're going to entice a top coach to come, then you better have a pretty darn good plan in place, let alone, a plan. So that's something that we don't know the full details as to what Michigan has to sell, but we do know from the past couple of years, NIL, at least that aspect of it, which is really pay for play, has not been good enough. And I think that's going to scare off some coaches. So what does your candidate pool look like? Obviously, we'll talk about in a second, but it's mostly made up of, at least early on here, of a lot of mid-major guys. And you can you can certainly hire a good coach from those ranks. I mean, that's a pretty common jump right now in college basketball, not just right now, but historically in college basketball. But at the same time, it is somewhat of a risk, and you don't want to be back in this situation 3 years from now because you hired somebody who didn't get it done in their first opportunity as a high major coach.
Yeah, it's important too, and we discussed this. You and I did a chainmail piece over the weekend. I think that was also on Friday. Basically saying that you have to, when you start assembling the list of candidates, it can't be the guy that is going to win the social media reviews or win the press conferences, a term that gets thrown around a lot. Like you have to, in terms of the timeline of this search and what it could look like, I think obviously it's wildly different than football. I think it was clear who the top candidate would be. You had that national title that you're looking to sustain some momentum from and kind of keep things together as you build what that next phase looks like. Now, I mean, I hate to see it, and you already see it, in the transfer portal. We'll talk about some of those guys as well, but there's not anything to sustain here. I think you can afford to take your time and make sure you run a true national search like Michigan says they are. Make sure you get the right guy. Make sure you talk to the right people. And I know there is a search firm involved. A couple people had asked about that, so it's not solely on Ward Manual.
Turnkey.
With Turnkey. That's right. They've been they've had a hand in Michigan searches before, haven't they? Was that a Harbaugh thing before? So I think there's a Michigan tie there somewhere. But yeah, they're gonna exhaust all their options. Again, Chris Ballas earlier today. It sounds like right now, maybe the top quote unquote two guys. You're looking at Dusty May. I know Nico Medved is a guy at Colorado State that I know has modeled his game or modeled his coaching style a lot around what John Beilein did at Michigan. So I think those are two names that make sense to me. I think that obviously, from a administrative perspective, I think you're right. Like you have to have, you have to have a plan to sell, an NIL plan to sell. I know admissions is a consideration. And the thing about admissions too, is that I don't know that there's really going to be an appetite to change that at Michigan until we get a little further down the road where these student athletes are considered university employees, because it seems like we are on the speeding freight train to that. I think maybe then you see some things getting loosened up, but there are some hurdles to clear there. So, I mentioned Dusty May, I mentioned Nico Medved. Who are some other guys to you that would stand out as guys that would be fits here? Because there are a lot of them. If you're going to scour the country and even scour the NCAA tournament, as I did earlier on Monday, there are some interesting names, no doubt.
Yeah, there are some interesting rumors too, including from Trilly Donovan about about John Calipari. And hey, if Michigan were to give him everything he wanted, which includes a pretty massive salary, I would assume, hey, maybe he would be interested. And obviously that's been a weird situation for a couple of years at Kentucky, where the fan base is pretty fed up with him. I was at the game between St. Peter's and Kentucky a couple of years ago, and that was kind of, it wasn't even the start of it, but that was kind of a boiling point for them. So maybe Cal would escape somewhere. It just doesn't feel like that's a fit for Michigan. I think that would be a tough one to sell a lot of people on, although he's obviously an accomplished coach, no matter which way he's gotten it done. And now in college basketball, you have to start thinking about this element too. Pretty much anything goes in terms of rules. I don't know if there are any rules. So, but no, I mean, I don't think something like that is going to happen. I mean, you look at a lot of guys that, and even Dusty May, he had the run to the Final Four last year at Florida Atlantic. But he's not overly proven in terms of being able to run this successful mid-major for a long time. Now, that is one of the tougher jobs in college basketball, and he's been able to have success there. Was a student assistant, a student manager under Bob Knight at Indiana. He's got some really good pedigree, understands the Big Ten. Indiana's keeping Mike Woodson, so you might be able to get him this year. Nico Medved is another guy that's done a pretty good job at Colorado State. Michigan obviously beat him 2 years ago in the first round. He's somebody, he does run the two-guard offense like John Beilein and kind of modeled his offense there. He's done a decent job, but that's kind of a top half of the Mountain West type of program right now to me, as opposed to somebody who's just winning at this incredible clip. Somebody who intrigues me, and I know is kind of generated buzz, at least through the fan base, is Darian DeVries from Drake, who is kind of running a program that wins at a really high clip. And he actually took over for Medved after Medved spent 1 year at Drake. He takes over. They've made the tournament the last 2 years. They made it in 2021, and they won a first-round game as well. They were kind of that hot team for a little while coming into the tournament as a mid-major. So he's somebody that does intrigue me. They went 28-6 this year, won the conference tournament in the Missouri Valley. Seems like some good coaching going on in the Missouri Valley. I know Josh Schertz from Indiana State's going to get the St. Louis job, but those are guys that can kind of make the jump. But again, we're looking at somebody making a jump, and that's a little bit risky to me. Would I give the job to John Beilein? I would. I don't think Ward Manuel has. I don't know if he's talked to him since John Beilein left in 2019, and that's disappointing to me, given what John Beilein's done for this program. I would take John Beilein for a few years and get this thing on solid footing. Just given the other options out there at this point, not that one of them's not going to work out. Would I try to lure a Billy Donovan? I would also do that, right? He's somebody who's proven he's won national championships at Florida, the Bulls. How much longer is he going to be there? So, yeah, rambling thoughts on some of the different candidates. So apologies for that. But, Kyle Smith, at Washington State is another guy who's been mentioned. He's made his first NCAA tournament this year, though. So that kind of scares me a little bit. I know people have compared him to Beilein in terms of demeanor and maybe the way he's recruited to different programs that are hard to recruit to. I mean, Columbia, San Francisco, and then Washington State, what he's been able to do this year, even though they're not going to have a conference next year, is pretty impressive. But Pac-12 wasn't all that good. So that's another rambling thought on Kyle Smith from Washington State.
Yeah, here's the thing about John Beilein. And again, I don't – now, if I was told that John Beilein wanted the job and that all Ward Manuel had to do was call him, I'd probably do that. Because if we're steering this coaching search towards, they're trying to find the next John Beilein. Well, you could also just have the bird in hand, knowing that the guy exists. He exists and he still breathes oxygen, right? And he's there to be had. Now, again, I also see the other side of it where you're talking about wanting to make a hire that hopefully you don't have to make a coaching change for the next 5 to 10 years. And I get there's a little more long term of a view, but who's to say that John Beilein couldn't go 5 more years or so? But again, I think that when you look at towards a couple guys, it's probably not going to be Nate Oates signed a contract extension to Alabama. I know he was popular at fans, a guy that used to coach at Romulus High School, just down the road from me. I believe the buyout in his new contract is $18 million. Michigan's not paying that. I think TJ Otzelberger's at Iowa State is like $17 million. I don't see them paying that.
He would be a great one too. And yeah, Oates didn't sign that thing to then leave. He wouldn't have signed it if he had interest. So
I think it's very telling that really within hours of that Michigan job opening up, Greg Byrne from Alabama is like, nope, this is done. We're working on
a proactive athletic director. I will say, give him credit there. And then also we should have mentioned Shaka Smart too at Marquette. Mm-hmm. There are rumors and reports that his buyout is massive as well. They're a private school, so they don't have to disclose that, but sounds like that might be in double digits as well. And he was somebody that I think if he wanted to come from Texas, maybe he would have been. I think he would have been able to back in 2019. But now he's kind of in a more comfortable spot at Marquette. He left Texas on his own. Was kind of on the hot seat for a couple of years there. It doesn't seem like right now he's going to leave a basketball school that has NIL support to come to Michigan, which is disappointing. But here's the thing, Anthony, I know we talked a lot about this last year when Hunter Dickinson was going through the transfer portal process and Michigan was missing on some guys. And I remember we had these conversations where it's like, wait, look at all the schools that are in on these top transfers, including Hunter. Some of them had to do with his local ties to the DC area with Maryland and Georgetown, but Kansas in the mix. It's like the schools in West Virginia was getting in the mix. The schools that have the best NIL support are kind of basketball only schools. So if you're Shaka, given the nature of college basketball right now, one, he's got things going a little bit in his first couple of years there. They're a 2 seed this season, and you risk that to then come here and not get the support you want? And then what if you don't have a good year or two? Then you definitely won't have support. So it's kind of an interesting time right now in college basketball.
He's already done the dance where, he's at a football first school where
Exactly
all that people will do if you don't win basketball games at those type of schools is shit on you and chase you out, which is exactly what kind of happened. And then he is in a much better spot now. I think 5 years ago when that Michigan job was open the first time, I think would have been a lot more realistic. But, just running through the list here again, and the list I put out on Monday, just of guys I'm watching in the NCAA tournament. I think that 7-10 game between, and again, Michigan's coaching search is not going to hinge on who does well in the NCAA tournament, but a lot of guys, I mean, if you're putting odds on it, I think most of the candidates or most of the likely guys that are going to be in the mix for this job are in the NCAA tournament. So I look at that 7-10 game between Washington State and Drake. You got Kyle Smith and Darian DeVries too, also a Greg McDermott guy. So Greg McDermott, maybe a couple weeks ago, would have been high on a lot more people's lists, but just signed a contract extension at Creighton. He wants to retire there, but DeVries kind of comes from that Greg McDermott mold. From there, I think you start talking underrated guys, maybe guys to keep a little bit of a close eye on. Actually, I kind of like Pat Kelsey at Charleston. He's a guy that I think that's going to be a popular upset pick. I think that Charleston over Nate Oates in Alabama. I think a lot of people probably have that in their brackets, but Kelsey's an Ohio native. He made a pair of NCAA tournaments at Winthrop. They would have made a third one if not for COVID-19. And he's 58-11 over the last 2 years there.
Charismatic, energetic guy. Yeah, he's fun to watch his teams. I also was out for St. Patty's Day on Saturday, and big Michigan fan. Also wanted really Pat Kelsey Connor out there. Perfect name for St. Patty's Day as well. So hearing some buzz on that in the fan base as well from my endeavors at the bars this weekend.
Yeah, and you know what? The reason why I'm not as opposed to like mid-major type of guys, Danny Sprinkle at Utah State is another guy that
great name.
Again, Danny Sprinkle, yeah,
sounds
it's an awesome name.
To be honest,
the thing with a lot of those mid-major coaches is that if we're just operating under the assumption that Michigan doesn't have the NIL support you'd like it to have, and maybe recruiting is going to be a little more difficult. You have to go and find some maybe weird dudes to win, and that's to a certain extent what John Beilein was able to do, and then a lot of what Nico Medved has done at Colorado State. I kind of like those mid-major guys that have had sustained success because you are kind of piecing together rosters full of. I don't want to disrespect guys and call them leftovers, but to get into the NCAA tournament with some of those smaller schools, and if you're not pulling off first-round upsets, you're a popular pick most years to do so. I think there's something to be said about that too. So, again, I don't know how to power rank it right now. A couple people set up, asked on the board, well, who is the ideal candidate? Who fits best? And to be frank with you, I don't know who fits best because I don't know what Michigan's plan or its vision are right now. Knowing that, and maybe this is where we kind of transition quickly into what's going on with the roster. I mean, Doug McDaniel's in the transfer portal, George Washington in the transfer portal, Connie Ruth decommitted from Michigan earlier today. So, I mean, we're looking at a scenario where whoever comes in here is going to be pretty significantly flipping the roster. Darrell Brooks, Fat said he's going to wait to see what they do with the next head coach. I don't think we've heard from Christian Anderson yet, but, a lot's still up in the air. I know Terrace Reed can come back. Namari Burnett can come back. Will Cheddar, Terrence Williams has a fifth year if he chooses to use it. So it's a roster in flux, and there's going to be a lot of work to do here. So, I don't want to say that I don't envy the guy who comes in, because the guy who takes this job knows that he has a chance to kind of put his own stamp on it. But there's going to be a lot to sort out roster wise. And already, you lose your leading scorer, and which is not, I don't think that's unexpected at all. I think even no matter how things have played out with Juwan, given the fact that there was that academic suspension, I'm not stunned by this at all, Clayton, but your thoughts on some of the roster news that we've gotten.
Yeah, I mean, someone had to lead you in scoring, and it was Doug McDaniel. Mathematically, somebody has to, even when you go 8-24. So, I didn't think Doug was all that good this year, minus, the 3-0 start and a few games here and there. And I do think his season would have gone quite a bit differently had he not been suspended for road games, because He was then even out of sync in the home games that he was playing in. Played a little bit better offensively at the end of the year once he came back and was there in the lineup full time. But regardless, the fact that he was in that situation in and of itself is a red flag. He didn't play good enough defense. You're losing guys off of an 8-24 team. Now, the Connie Ruths thing was somewhat expected too, just in terms of speculation that if you were to lose Juwan Howard, you would probably lose a top 30 kid like him out of IMG Academy, 4-star. And he said he'll continue to consider Michigan, but I mean, it's just so far down the road. Like, you got to figure out who the coach is going to be at this point. George Washington III left it open in his statement about potentially returning to Michigan as well. Doug McDaniel said, respect the decision. So he didn't really mention anything about coming back to Michigan, and I wouldn't expect that to happen anyway. He'll probably go to a pretty decent school, but there are a lot of flaws in his game as well. So, yeah, it's not a huge deal that you're losing some of these guys, one, because you expected it, and two, because you were so bad last year. And the interesting part of hiring a new coach now, too, AB, is like, we saw what Mike Rhodes did at Penn State this year. They were able to bring in Ace Baldwin Jr. from VCU with him. He is the defensive player of the year in the Big Ten. They go 16-17. Wasn't a great season, but was better than a lot of people expected, given that they ranked 353rd in the country in minutes continuity, according to KenPom, which is last in the country. So they go about 500, much better than Michigan, double Michigan's win total. And, so part of it is whoever you bring in can bring some of their guys to Michigan now, assuming they get in through admissions. But that's a little bit of an element. That's more short term, and that'd be more icing on the cake if they do have like a conference player of the year or somebody like that. I think someone mentioned, was it DeVries that has a son on the team, or was it one of the other coaches? I saw that earlier today, who I guess is really good. So, you're going to lose a lot of guys. This roster is going to be flipped either way. And, George Washington, he didn't seem ready to really play, be a major or minor contributor for Michigan this year, even an 8-win team. So it's not like you're losing total studs here. It's nowhere near Hunter Dickinson or anything like that from last year. So, it's just kind of going to be an overhaul no matter what. And I think we're going to continue to see guys enter the portal.
A question here from Kyle TT, who says, what about Phil Martelli? Is he a staying or going candidate? I can't speak to that. Phil, to me, I think it's probably time to enjoy retirement. I think most of this year you look on the bench, and a lot of it may have had to do with team performance, but the poor guy just, if he had any more hair to lose, it would be gone completely. I mean, the guy just, I think, was put in a really tough spot early on, having to coach the team and that whole transition. I just think the last 2 years, we'll see, but I would expect a new coach to come in and kind of build out his own staff. I think what Michigan needs is top to bottom changes, to be frank with you. But, any other thoughts on state of the search timeline? I know some people were hoping that Michigan would maybe work quickly on this whole thing, but given that I think a lot of your candidates are getting ready to play games this weekend, that probably looking at early next week at the earliest, if you have, unless a guy blows your socks off. Otherwise, I know we haven't talked about, the Porter Mosers of the world at Oklahoma. They didn't make the tournament. A couple other names escape me of guys that might be on the list, but right now it seems like still very much in the candidate gathering phase, as opposed zeroing in on a guy and putting your stamp on it.
Yeah, and they're only 3 days in. I could see a scenario where by the end of this week, you have a kind of a read on who the top guys are, but they're not going to accept anything before they play this weekend, like you mentioned. So I think early next week at the earliest, and that's probably the case for a lot of these other schools too. I mean, Louisville's trying to hire. Ohio State got theirs done, but that was just because they promoted Jake Diebler from within. So, yeah, that's kind of the timeline. The portal is going to be open for the next 45 days for undergraduates. Grads can obviously go in at any time. So there's still going to be a lot of roster movement. I saw 250 guys went in today. There were 1,800 that went in last year during the offseason. So there's going to be there's going to be a lot of guys out on the market. Those guys aren't going to make decisions so quickly either, because teams are in the NCAA tournament. So it's not a huge race against the clock here, in my opinion. I mean, you can't go a month and a half without having a coach, right? But, a couple of weeks, if you get the right guy, is nothing to worry about.